Pay attention. When Mr. Bai is the goalkeeper, you just need to gently press the button to stop the ball. When there is no ball, there is a dog to serve you. This is a world football competition. As the referee's whistle sounds, the Pink Panther team comes out, followed by the whole team. I want to say that in front of such an important game, Mr. and Mrs. Fan only brought 3 children to participate. Is this really good? The whistle of the entrance again sounded. It's Mr. Bai's turn to come out. The first one to come out is the dog. Before the whistle sounded, 3 robots knocked him down. With the appearance of Mr. Bai, there are only 4 people in this team. I'm so happy. Now the football can be played by robots. This football can't be crushed yet. Looking at the 3 big blocks of iron, Mr. and Mrs. Fan are stunned. His team members can't stand it anymore. They want to run straight away. After pulling the team members back and comforting them, the whistle of the game finally sounded. After the 2 captains guessed first, Mr. Bai guessed wrong. When the referee was about to give the ball to the Pink Panther, the robot took action. Their referee was rubbed on the ground by the robot. Looking at Mr. and Mrs. Fan's defensive posture, it's quite normal. After the game started, facing Mr. and Mrs. Fan, the 3 kids, Mr. and Mrs. Bai, this team of robots have no mercy. They even stabbed each other with their hands. The robots are in a straight line. The team members on Mr. and Mrs. Fan's side are very panicked. They have to run away from a long distance, but how can he avoid the robots? At the end, there was a dog. Mr. and Mrs. Fan, who were about to shoot, didn't dare to be slow. They had to catch the ball in the air. However, these guys still use high technology. How high did the Pink Panther jump? As the referee's whistle sounded, Mr. and Mrs. Fan lost a point. Mr. and Mrs. Fan was very happy to see this. Mr. and Mrs. Fan didn't wait for instructions, so they ran to turn the tables. Then they quickly ran back to be the cheerleaders. I said, "You're a good dog." After the show, they had to come back to serve Mr. and Mrs. Fan. This time, it was Mr. and Mrs. Fan's turn to attack. The 3 kids were actually very smart. They swung the robot flexibly. It was hard to hit the goal. But as the goalkeeper, Mr. and Mrs. Fan was not afraid at all. Just before the ball flew, the white dog took out the remote control. Mr. and Mrs. Fan pressed the button leisurely. A wall came out of the ground and blocked the ball that was flying. The referee saw this obvious cheating. He raised the red card, but Mr. and Mrs. Fan didn't bother him at all. The robot standing next to the referee even threw the red card a few times. The referee just wanted it. The robot didn't give it to him and caught the referee out. He replaced the dog to be their referee. Are they going to play tricks to the end? The eyes of the public can see that the dog is Mr. and Mrs. Fan's. The game is still going on. Looking at the children's super skills, the robot couldn't stand it at all. Mr. and Mrs. Fan came up with another idea. After greeting the dog and expressing his intention to drive away 3 children, the dog, who was drinking the drink, immediately blew the whistle and forced the child to put on the stamp. Then he called the goalkeeper. The goalkeeper was very responsible. In less than a moment, a member of Mr. and Mrs. Fan was sent to travel with the former referee. It's the second child's turn. This is a little girl. The white dog drove the ice cream truck. Under the temptation of ice cream, another member fell into the hands of the white dog. Facing the 2 robots rushing over, the last member was under great pressure. But when he was concentrating on defense, the white dog actually played a game on the side. The last member couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand it at all. In this way, the last member took the game console and drifted away slowly with the balloon. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Fan need to face the attack of 3 robots alone. He was not afraid at all. The game is over. But the opponents, Little Net tied the net directly to the pillar. Looking at the pink bun that can't move, Mr. and Mrs. Fan were very happy. Looking at the football rushing over, Mr. and Mrs. Fan actually blocked it with his tail. I'm tired. I'm afraid you're going to turn over. Oh my god. This has knocked down all 3 of my levels. After blocking a few waves of attacks, Mr. and Mrs. Fan played a game on the side. I didn't expect the pink bun to be all pink. As the pink bun finished the game, Mr. and Mrs. Fan put a pink old 6 doll in front of the goal. But this doll looks like it's out of order. Next, Mr. and Mrs. Fan will perform alone. Every time they score a goal, Mr. and Mrs. Fan will have a dance. Then serve Mr. and Mrs. Fan. But as they score more and more goals, the number of runs is getting more and more frequent. Mr. and Mrs. Fan also started to be exhausted. If Mr. and Mrs. Fan don't play the game again, I'm sure they'll kill the white dog. Mr. and Mrs. Fan saw the score and didn't give up. It's really brave. With Mr. and Mrs. Fan serving, this fire finally showed the speed of the bun. Directly blow up the 2 robots of Mr. and Mrs. Fan. This almost scared Mr. and Mrs. Fan to death. The last robot was playing with Mr. and Mrs. Fan. He actually pulled out a mechanical arm. I said, "You're starting to play bad. You can't beat the pink bun." When the last robot was blown up, Mr. and Mrs. Fan began to panic. He needs someone to face Mr. and Mrs. Fan. Before the pink bun shot the goal, Mr. and Mrs. Fan ran away. Looking at the football, he was about to score. Mr. and Mrs. Fan actually opened a high shot. I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Fan, you're so bad. With so many points ahead of you, you opened a high shot. Are you really so afraid of Mr. and Mrs. Fan?" Looking at the high shot that jumped up, Mr. and Mrs. Fan began to transform. He can actually shoot out countless goals. The pink bun showed Shaolin's strength. At this point, even the mechanical arm had to give way to him. Mr. and Mrs. Fan, who were drowned by a bunch of footballs, was stuck in the net. I didn't expect the last winner to be a pink bun with a single shot. If you like it, please subscribe. The next episode is more exciting. Take a look. Mr. and Mrs. Fan was forced to fall off the volcano, but his subordinates ate the food sent by the landowner. It turned out that the pirate Mr. and Mrs. Fan and his dog followed the treasure map and prepared to dig the island for the treasure. The dog told Mr. and Mrs. Fan that he was going to the destination. Mr. and Mrs. Fan just stepped into the shipwreck. He was even thrown out. It's not easy to pull out the wooden board. He hurriedly took out the map to confirm. He had to change his fake hand, belt buckle, and fake nails into gold. He had to change his fake hand, belt buckle, and fake nails into gold. He also put gold teeth on the dog. He just finished fantasizing. Suddenly, he found that the pink bun was passing by on a small boat. Oh no, this pink bun is here to grab the treasure. He had to catch it. He immediately commanded the dog to enter the throwing machine. Mr. and Mrs. Fan aimed and launched it out. He was about to catch the pink bun, but the rope was too short and was pulled back. The force of the rebound hit the boat into a big hole. The big boat sank in less than 2 seconds. The bad thing is that it also pressed on the octopus. The angry octopus threw Mr. and Mrs. Fan to the beach. With the help of Mr. and Mrs. Fan finally pulled their heads out of the sand. They didn't wait for the boat to breathe. The pirate boat was also thrown over. Fortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Fan swam fast. The two were left behind found the footprints of the pink bun. They immediately followed the footprints. Then they looked at the pink bun. When they met the swamp, they went straight to the other side in a beautiful turn. Mr. and Mrs. Fan didn't pay attention. They stepped in directly. The dog jumped directly on Mr. and Mrs. Fan's head. Mr. and Mrs. Fan finally caught the big tree next to them. They were not happy yet. They were dragged down by the mud. Mr. and Mrs. Fan finally escaped. They just wanted to clean up the sand on their bodies. But they were caught by the snake. The pink bun on the other side just ran over the bridge. They didn't wait for Mr. and Mrs. Fan to catch up. Mr. and Mrs. Fan were helped to find and carried back. Mr. and Mrs. Fan didn't panic at all. They watched the landowners singing and dancing. They even had a fight with their leader. This dance got the leader's approval. It was given to the treasure map of Mr. and Mrs. Fan. After the pink bun thanked the landowner leader, he immediately ran to the treasure site. Mr. and Mrs. Fan saw Mr. and Mrs. Fan. They got the treasure map. They were so angry that they jumped. Then the mud stream came. They came directly to the landowner. The landowner saw them and was scared to run away. The landowner followed Mr. and Mrs. Fan all the way to the volcano. The landowner was getting closer. Mr. and Mrs. Fan also followed. They fell into the volcano without noticing. The dog saw the landowner and was scared, but the landowner brought food to the dog. The dog ate the food and saw the owner was shot out by the volcano. When they finally found the treasure map, they saw only one deep pit. Obviously, they were caught by the pink bun. Mr. and Mrs. Fan were so angry that they jumped. Then they found a huge pink bun behind the mountain. They were so scared that they jumped into the sea. Here, our pink bun was riding its hot air balloon and went home with a box of gold coins. If you like it, please subscribe. The next episode is more exciting.